Hello friends, thank you for listening. We created this channel to bring a sense of structure and depth to the incredible world of storytelling. Here, we dive into fantasy, action, magic, and mayhem, exploring the thrilling realms of Chinese cultivation novels, Korean regressor revenge stories, and Japanese isekai adventures. If you love epic battles, mystical powers, legendary heroes, and gripping tales of destiny, this is the place for you. Join us as we unravel the best of fantasy fiction and bring you stories that transport you to new worlds. Subscribe now and become part of the adventure.
Casey released the gathered force, throwing Monson into a state of shock as the dripping ball of red energy exploded, leaping from his palm. Monson watched in horror as it passed through the empty space between them. He could feel the discharge of energy imbuing his body. There was no sound, nor strange sensation. It felt no different from being tossed, but the impact threw him several yards and he landed with a smack on the mat. "Dude, told ya." Casey came walking over to Monson. He looked very pleased with himself, but very tired. "Impossible," Monson groaned, laying flat on his back. "How on earth did you do that?" "Sorry, man. Tricks of the trade." Disappointed, Monson put his hand on his back, feeling the place where he had landed. His body felt funny. It was almost as if Casey shocked him, but not quite. The sensation was difficult to explain. What he could say, however, is that he was already sore. "I think you broke my back." He continued to touch his back gingerly. He started to get up, but then thought better of it as his muscles started to strain. He felt totally embarrassed. He must have looked very uncool just now. He quietly eyed Casey. "That was for real." The misty light was gone now, and Casey was back to normal. He twisted a bit, trying to feel the extent of the damage. Strangely, no evidence of what just transpired hung in the air. Nothing. Anywhere. What was going on? Something was not right. Not right at all. "Seriously, Casey, how'd you do that?" He continued, not allowing Casey to answer his question. If that was real, it was amazing. He had to know. "How do you bring to focus all that energy on your hand and then discharge it over the empty space? I mean, really, how are you able to control it once you gathered?" Casey looked sharply at Monson, which cut him off. "Dude, how'd you know that?" "How did I know what?" "How'd you know that I was controlling energy, that it wasn't just a normal punch? That isn't something that you could see." "Casey, you threw me 20 feet without even touching me. How is that a normal punch?" "Excuse me," said a distinctly female voice. Both boys jumped, which was a feat considering that Monson was still on the ground in a jumble. They both turned to see who had startled them. Indigo Harrison stood a few feet away. "That was amazing. How did you do that?" Unexpected. Totally unexpected. Casey looked even more confused than before. He did not answer right away, but turned towards Monson and offered him a hand. "How did I do what?" Indigo may not have noticed, or maybe she just did not know Casey very well, but this was the most serious that Monson had ever seen him. "How did you make him go flying without even touching him? That takes an awful lot of energy to do something like that. You were using Flash Fist, right?" Casey turned to look at her. The implications of her words were clear. "Who told you that?" Casey's voice was deathly quiet. "They did." Indigo pointed to a group of people not far away. Among the group was the short fencer they had watched earlier. Standing by her was Kylie Cormack. Casey's eyes tensed. "Ah, I see." Apparently this information meant something to him. He looked angry as he started in Kylie's direction. She appeared caught up in conversation, however, and did not feel or was just ignoring the murderous eyes boring into the back of her head. Monson was at a loss, not really understanding the unfolding events. "They want to know if you can fight for real, or if you're just pretending." Indigo pushed the hair out of her face. There was something in her voice that Monson did not like. She knew something that she was not saying. "Tcha, what's it to them?" Indigo did not answer but threw something to Casey that Monson had not noticed. It was a pointed stick made out of what looked like bamboo. Now he was really lost. "No." Casey threw the stick on the ground in front of her. "If we're going to do this, we're using Bolkin, not Shinai." There was no more need for words. Casey received a hardwood bokken from a small, shy-looking girl who seemed scared to go near him. The bokken looked longer than the one that Monson owned and seemed a bit more angled. Casey stared over at the short fencer and Kylie with a scathing glare. He made it very clear he would accept the challenge. He pointed at the bokken in his hands, making sure that the masked fighter acknowledged him. The group walked over as people moved out of Casey's way like he was Moses parting the Red Sea. Many of them looked tense. Casey walked right up to the short fighter, scowling at the masked individual. Monson studied Casey's opponent, trying to get a read on him. With his mask on, there was no way of knowing what he was thinking. The short fighter gave Casey a slight nod of the head and started to walk towards the center of the mat. Monson appreciated that he could pick up certain things about people even when he did not hear a voice or see a face. This person seemed cold and unassuming. There was no air of playfulness or sport. It felt like the two were going to war. Casey looked at Monson, giving him a little smile. Again, "Oh, no," was the only thought that Monson could muster. Casey started to a sideline where some students waited. They gave him an assortment of armor, very similar in appearance to his opponent's. He put it on quickly, strapping it into place. He then went into the same routine as before. Monson recognized Casey's movements. He shook his head. He blinked. He concentrated. When Casey was finished, he took the bokken in a double-handed grip and pointed it at an angle away from his body, towards the ground. The second fighter assumed a similar display, standing flat-footed, completely square to Casey. Then, raising both hands out in front of him, he displayed his weapon. He held the mock short sword by both hilt and tip, horizontally in front of him. It looked like he was offering the blade to a king as a gesture of fealty. He gave Casey a slight bow, then moved the sword clockwise until it was perpendicular to its original position. He stood motionless, allowing Casey and the crowd to take in his movements. Then, he slowly released the top of the blade, tracing its length with his left hand from top to bottom. His left hand finally came to rest on the hilt, snugly next to his right. He stood in a slightly defensive stance, putting most of his weight on his back foot, body leaning away from Casey. Both fighters surveyed one another for a moment. At least, that's what Monson thought they were doing, because he could not see either of their faces behind the masks. Casey struck first, confirming Monson's suspicion that he would do so. He guessed this for two reasons. First, Casey's sword was longer, which would give him an advantage in an attack. Second, he still did not know Casey really well, but he knew him well enough to know that he was the impatient sort. Maybe their little fight was all the convincing that Monson needed to know that he was right. Casey's blow, a powerful one from overhead, barely hit wood as the shorter fighter stepped back and away, merely flicking his wrist to deflect it. Casey's body language almost screamed his astonishment as the short fighter stepped forward, assuming the original position, and settled in the same defensive stance. Even if Casey felt surprised, he was quickly moving past it. He stepped lightly around his opponent, projecting his intent and the determination of his movements. Monson could actually sense Casey's delight at the challenge. Casey renewed his attack, rushing forward with a combination of thrusts and fluid arcs that seemed less befitting a Japanese longsword than a saber or rapier. The short fencer, with increasing agility, moved with just as much fluidity and evasiveness as before. Curiously enough, Monson found that he was watching his friend less and less, and the shorter opponent more and more. Smaller than Casey, and probably a lot weaker considering Casey's freakish strength, it was amazing that no matter what Casey did, he could not land a single blow. Whenever Casey seemed to move close enough, the small fighter seemed to move in just the right way to deflect or avoid. They proceeded in this manner, and after a while, Monson could tell that Casey was starting to get more and more serious, though it was difficult to see him as many people in front of him blocked his view. This shorter fighter seemed rather popular. People were watching with overt fascination. Monson was among them. In fact, Monson felt so intrigued by the match that he moved, despite all the glares and shocked faces, so he could see the fight properly. This enabled him to see the more intricate parts of the match. No, not the match. The fight. This was definitely a fight, not merely a match. Now much closer than before, he was able to see Casey's expression ever so slightly, but the mask was still blocking the greater part of it. He scrutinized what he could see of his friend's face. Steely glints in the eyes spoke volumes about his emotional state. Anger was starting to take over. It was somewhat scary to think about what could happen if something pushed Casey too far. He doubted anyone else noticed, but as the match progressed, Monson could see that slowly, Casey's strikes were becoming stronger, faster, and more frequent. Yet even in his frenzy, the short fencer still eluded him. Even worse than his evasiveness was the short fencer's unwillingness to throw even a single counterattack. Not one blow. Horror suddenly struck Monson. Unbelievable as it was happening. Again. The misty, indistinct red light that tossed him mere moments ago was beginning to gather at the base of Casey's feet and hands. This time, however, it was different. It quickly gathered and condensed, infusing his arms and legs. "I gotta stop this," Monson said to no one in particular. He noticed that Artorius was making his way over to him. He yelled to Artorius, "He's gonna—" There was a loud thud as wood and armor collided. The short fighter finally countered. Still in his pose, he was holding his sword in the space that would have been right at the base of Casey's neck, if Casey were still occupying that space. Casey hit the floor hard, lapsing into a semi-conscious state. Monson took in the scene, looking first at the short fighter, then at Casey. Thankfully, the red light dispersed, leaving no traces. Both Monson and Artorius rushed over to Casey, who was struggling to get back to his feet. "Sit down." Monson put a hand on Casey, almost pushing him back to the floor. Casey grunted as he hit. He seemed not to notice Monson's actions and was looking aimlessly for his mock sword. The fighter must have hit Casey harder than Monson thought. "Look, you're gonna hurt yourself if you keep this up." "Keep him sitting down," said a soft, slightly musical voice. "I hit him between the shoulder and the neck. That spot can mess up your equilibrium." Thanks." Monson glanced over the short fighter. "You guys put on quite the show." He stopped as the fighter removed his gloves to show small fingers that were well-groomed but unadorned. He stared at the fingers. He looked up and stood, facing the fighter. "I don't mean to be rude, but who are you?" Cyan! That was amazing! You've progressed even faster than I thought." He turned to see the new voice. Indigo Harrison smiled widely as he about-faced to look sharply at her. He turned back, gazing more intently at the fencer. "Cyan?" Monson could feel his mouth dropping to the floor. No, it couldn't be. "Cyan Harrison." The fighter finally pulled off the mask. Monson and Artorius almost choked as a mountain of dark black hair rushed out in every direction, mounds of it flowing over its owner's head and shoulders. The short fighter was a girl. A short, gorgeous girl. The absence of the fencing mask revealed a truly lovely, unadorned face, with high cheekbones, a perfectly rounded chin, and eyelashes that any woman would die for. Crisp, sapphire eyes of the deepest blue gazed back softly with an unassuming stare. Monson looked closer at her. Her eyes, light blue on the outer rims and steadily becoming darker and closer to the pupil, were like the stone hanging in his gym locker, only a different color. The only distracting feature of this vision of natural perfection was the look of simple glumness, as if she were sad but could not articulate why. He did not know what to say in light of this new development. Luckily, Artorius was there to break the tension.
Dude, you just got your butt kicked by a chick. I gotta tell Mom about... Ouch!
Do you care to repeat that? Monson looked at Artorius and chuckled as he watched him rub his head. From the looks of it, he had just received a sharp smack on the head with Cyan's balkan.
No, I got the picture.
That was amazing. Monson stood up and addressed Cyan. Where did you learn to fight like that? The dark-haired girl surveyed him for a moment, lingering on his face, as if she were trying to take in the details. Something in her eyes changed as she opened her mouth to speak. He had almost forgotten himself. He was a freak, after all. He should expect this reaction from people, especially beautiful girls like this one. Wait, that was not it. For some reason, he knew what she was going to say, and it had nothing to do with his appearance. Oh, yes, I am. He cut across her, a knowing look on his face. And it's a pleasure to meet you. Cyan looked at him for a moment, an indiscernible look on her face. What are you talking about? This answer surprised him, leaving him speechless for a moment. It also gave him the chance to notice just how many people were watching their little exchange. Oh, well, you were going to ask me if I was the new Hornveer, weren't you? No. Actually, I had already figured that out. Her voice was steady, almost cold. I was just going to ask you to get off my glove. It's very expensive. He looked down, and sure enough, he was standing on top of one of the gloves that were in her hands moments ago. He could already see the outline of a dusty shoe print. How did that happen? Oh, sorry about that. He cursed inside his head. Why did he have to go red? It's okay. I guess I shouldn't have dropped it. She picked up the dusty glove. Everyone in the crowd continued to watch, perhaps a little too intently. There was silence after that. Everyone mostly stared at one another, no one knowing really what to say. Well, this experience has been moderately embarrassing. Casey was moving slowly to his feet. Don't get too comfortable, though. His eyes focused at Cyan. You and I are definitely going to have a rematch. Cyan gave him a slight nod. I'll look forward to it. Then, without saying another word, she turned and walked away. Later, Gators. Indigo ran after the older girl. Casey gestured to Artorius and Monson, indicating he wanted them to follow him. They walked slowly away from the now dispersing crowd.
I've never seen anything like that.
Artorius appeared in awe.
When was the last time you lost so severely?
Casey shook his head. Unbelievable. Cyan Harrison? Wait, Arthur, isn't your girlfriend named Harrison? Artorius looked thoughtfully at him.
Yeah, I think so. And don't call me Arthur.
Monson mirrored the sentiment. I'm positive that's the name. Indigo, was it? Gave to me earlier. Sisters. They have to be sisters. It would make sense. Monson thought back to the girl, her countenance and moves. He added, She sure was amazing, wasn't she? I've never seen anything like that. Like a whirlwind. It was almost scary. Yeah, she's good, I have to admit that. She sure is intense. I wonder why. Monson wondered the same thing. Something about that girl intrigued him. He would have to watch out for this Miss Harrison, that much was for sure. Things at Corin just got a whole lot more interesting. The remainder of that first day's gym class passed in an uneventful way. Monson checked in with Coach Abel, quickly finding him after the spur-of-the-moment kendo match that left him in such awe. Directly after their encounter with Cyan, they found some upperclassmen that Artorius knew from his primary school days and were able to confirm their theory. Cyan and Indigo were in fact sisters. This was not a startling revelation, though something about the two girls nagged at Monson. Maybe because they looked nothing alike and their personalities were so different. He was not sure. The boys spent the rest of the period watching both kendo and European fencing matches in the hopes of keeping a low profile. After class, all three of them dressed with as much haste as possible. Their reasons for doing so were very different, however. Casey wanted to avoid the embarrassment of getting thrashed by a girl, news of which was spreading quickly among the freshman students. Monson, by the end of class, felt nervous as he caught glimpses of the boys who accosted him outside the locker room and had a strange feeling that they may have regained their nerve and were planning something nasty. Artorius was anxious as he felt torn, thinking he may be making some headway with Indigo Harrison. What kind of headway, Monson really did not know, nor was he particularly interested in finding out. It was still a big deal to Artorius, so Monson made sure not to poke fun. The first day of classes ended with the boys retreating to their rooms for homework, briefly reuniting for a short dinner later that evening. After dinner, Monson turned in early, feeling exhausted. He slept dreamlessly that night. The next day was more of the same, except Casey's injury took a turn for the worse. By mid-afternoon, his shoulder was black, purple, and blue, and very sensitive to the touch. Just moving it seemed to cause him a great deal of pain. Aggravating the whole ordeal was the news of Casey's huge loss. It spread like the plague, so that by the time second period came, it seemed that everyone knew. This, in combination with his injury, put Casey in a very foul mood. Artorius spent most of the day looking for Indigo, who was conspicuously absent. When Artorius could not find her, he went from hopeful optimist to absolute defeatist. The whole thing grated on Monson's nerves greatly. After their classes were finished, they returned to Monson's place after another long day, and were now trying to help Casey, who was finally recovering from his foul mood with a bit of laughter, mixed with pain.
Dude, I can't believe this.
Casey held an icy hot pack on his thoroughly bruised shoulder.
I don't think I've received a blow like that since I told my Uncle Dathan that his new wife had a butt that should be marked as a wide load.
Well, that was dumb. Monson fingered the silver-gray stone around his neck. Why'd you do that? I'm socially retarded, and even I know that's just asking for trouble.
Had to be done, bro.
Casey shrugged, then winced in pain. He recovered and looked around rather deviously.
Dude, when she wore hip huggers, it was like looking at a crescent moon.
The comment put Monson into raucous laughter. Casey joined in, while Artorius offered an incredibly pitiful smile from the armchair next to the window. The three of them sat in Monson's front room, watching Casey tend to his wounds from his encounter with Cyan. Wounds that were far worse than they initially appeared. Monson was holding a small mirror for Casey, who was smarting at his own touch in the attempt to apply the pack to the affected area. Artorius was not taking notice of any of this, however. He just sat, looking incredibly forlorn for some reason.
Come on, Arthur. We do live in the same building. You'll see that hottie again. I promise.
Artorius just sighed. Monson could have sworn he heard a murmured, "Don't call me Arthur." He could not help but feel sorry for Artorius, even if it was a bit funny.
So, what's the plan?
Casey looked both amused and in pain, creating a very funny expression. He looked questioningly at Monson.
Well, I suppose that we could get ready for dinner and...
He stopped short as he looked at Casey's face. He guessed what the expression on his face meant.
Or we can just try and figure out something here.
Casey looked pacified.
Yeah, I think that would be best.
Monson smiled at him in a very patronizing sort of way. Casey threw a couch pillow at Monson. Monson grabbed a second pillow and was about to lay into him when a commotion outside the apartment interrupted them. They both stopped, Casey looking very relieved. They all listened. It sounded like someone was trying to get in. Monson, realizing what was going on, moved towards the door of his apartment.
"Oh, hey, Brian."
He opened the door and stepped aside.
"Ah, Master Grey."
Brian gave him a slight bow.
Perfect timing. Would you be so kind?
He gestured to several large brown paper bags in his arms.
Oh yeah, of course.
Monson took one of the heavier-looking bags and turned and re-entered his apartment. He placed the bag on the counter of his kitchenette, then sat down.
Hey, brad guy.
Casey moved towards the bar, followed closely by a still depressed Artorius. Brian turned towards Casey and Artorius with a smile on his face.
Ah, Master K, Master Payne. How nice to see you. I hope I find you both well.
Casey tried to smile, but seemed to be finding it difficult.
I guess I can't complain.
He paused, adjusting his body.
At least, not too much.
Okay. Artorius looked steadily at the ground.
You certainly do not look like you're doing well.
Brian had a knowing look on his face.
Girl problems? Yeah, but not in the way you'd think.
Yes, in exactly the way you'd think.
Brian smiled, a small twinkle in his eye.
Well then, shall we start with you, Master K?
Hey, why do we have to start with him?
The other three turned to look at Artorius, both shocked and amused at his indignation.
Well, the only thing that happened to Casey was he got his butt kicked by a girl. I have a real problem.
Man!
Casey popped Artorius on the arm.
Seriously, not cool. And I don't know what you're on about. Serious problem. Give me a break. You did just meet the girl, and she lives in the same building, Arthur. The same building, dude.
It's meant to be.
Artorius crossed his arms.
Besides, I don't know what you are so worked up about. It's not like you haven't ever lost a fencing match.
He paused.
And don't call me Arthur.
Perhaps I can help.
Brian interjected before either of them could continue. They both stopped abruptly. Monson just laughed to himself. Brian had a certain way of capturing people's attention.
Very well. Are you three ready to listen now? Hey, don't toss me into this. I'm just here for the ride.
Artorius and Casey both glared at Monson. He looked back as if to say, "What'd I say?" The three boys shifted their attention as Brian zoned in on Casey, who looked slightly uncomfortable.
Very well, then. So, it seems that you found yourself in a fencing match and lost. Am I correct?
Casey nodded his head in affirmation, despite continuing to look troubled.
Well then, I suppose I'm at a loss as to what the problem is.
His tone was light and friendly. He was obviously trying to placate Casey.
You have fenced before, have you not? You are bound to lose some matches. That is merely part of the game. Why would that trouble you? It's not that I lost, bro.
Casey's eyes were slightly distant.
It's how bad I lost. I couldn't land a single blow. It's like the girl was in my head, planning my next move for me. I even started to adjust my style, and she knew exactly when to counterattack right before I could get into my stride. I've studied fencing for a good number of years, and I've studied the mechanics of fencing and fighting for most of my life, and I've never seen anything like it. The fight was more like an actual sword duel than a kendo match. It seemed almost inhuman. Adjusted his style? Thought Monson, looking down at his hands. What does that mean?
He strained his mind for a moment, thinking back to Cyan and Casey's fight.
The red light,
he said to himself.
That has to be what Casey's referring to. Does the use of that, what did Casey call it, chakra, constitute a separate style of fighting, even when using a weapon?
He paused as he considered this. He continued thinking to himself.
What would have happened if Casey used chakra-based attacks?
He decided he did not want to think about that anymore. After Casey's thoroughly honest description and his total indignation, Brian was laughing. It appeared to be no more than amusement, a moment of pointed revelation. It was not vindictive or cruel, nor did it have a hint of malicious intent. It was a good thing that Casey was hurt, because he just might have come across the bar in reaction to Brian's mirth. Casey actually stood up when Brian did not stop.
Please, calm down. If you do not, I will refuse to tell you what happened, and the reason you lost so thoroughly."
Casey sat back down, but went back to glaring at Brian, who just continued to smile. Artorius was also laughing. Finally.
"Master K."
Brian sounded like he was explaining something very abstract to someone very obtuse.
"Do you mind if I wager a guess as to whom you were fighting?"
Casey's attention riveted itself to Brian's words.
"Long, dark hair, beautiful blue eyes, short movements, very smooth, does not smile."
All three boys looked dazed as if Brian just finished broadsiding them with a bus. Casey spoke first.
"Dude, how on earth did you know?" "Master K."
He had another slight smile dawning on his face.
"Do you know how long I've been employed at Collin?"
Again silence.
"Well, of course you would not know. That is not information you would be privy to."
The boys nodded their agreement.
"Never mind then. The young lady in question, Cyan Harrison, is one of the best fencers I have ever had the pleasure of watching. Master fencers from Japan to Europe, in every style possible, have traveled to see for themselves the girl's implacable style. Do not feel bad, Cassius. That girl is in an entirely different league." "Oh, that makes me feel loads better. What about her style? Do you know who taught her or how she became so good?" "Sadly, that is information I do not possess."
Brian scratched his chin.
"Truth be told, I never really considered the possibilities."
Casey looked bothered by this, but his questions were not finished.
"Well, while we're on the subject, why is she using a Balkan instead of a Shinai? And what about the lack of a referee?"
Brian laughed. The boys did not see what was so funny.
"Incidentally, that has caused some controversy among the staff. How amusing that you boys noticed it."
"What's so amazing about not having a referee?" Casey and Artorius looked like they were wondering the same thing.
"Please do not misunderstand. The lack of a referee is not the humorous part. The humor comes from the stupidity of youth. The combatants fight, knowing they can be injured. Cyan avoids retaining the services of a judge because she feels that rules are too restricting, that combat should be allowed to flow freely, that skill will determine the winner, not rules."
This pronouncement baffled all three of the boys. Monson was still confused.
"But, wait, what's funny about that?" "The funny part, Master Grey, is this. Cyan strikes a deal with the boys who fight her. If they can best her, she agrees to accompany them as they attempt to court her."
What?
All three boys shouted in unison. Brian again looked amused.
"At least, that is what I am told. Sadly enough, the poor girl remains dateless." "Seriously, what a weird chick." "Well, regardless of what she does to train, she hits like a bull. I'm not going to be able to lift my arm for a week."
He stopped suddenly, horror starting to dominate his features.
"Oh no, seriously? This can't be happening." "What?"
Artorius, Monson, and Brian jumped at the same time.
"Dude, I can't believe this. Of all the freaking bad times this could have happened..." "All what could have happened, Casey?" "Dude, tryouts for the Legion are on Monday. There's no way I'm going to be able to play with a bruised shoulder. That girl just ruined my tryout."